Other developments in practice in the 20th century, we've already kind of hinted at. When we talked about fundamentalism in the context of doctrine, we noted that with the Scopes trial and the failure of fundamentalists to hold on to a persona that garnered respectability led a lot of fundamentalists to retreat from society. They developed their own institutions, believing that a lot of American culture was against them. So they developed a fortress mentality. Some of those institutions were devoted to education. And so they developed Bible institutes. They developed seminaries that were focused on teaching, preparing fundamentalist preachers. Moody Bible Institute is perhaps the most recognizable, the most successful. Other groups would include Dallas Theological Seminary. The focus was predominantly the teaching of fundamentalist doctrine, preparing students to go out and share that doctrine. Fundamentalists also started summer camps, summer programs, a way to provide Christian recreation that would be an alternative to more worldly recreation, the kind of the fundamentalist tourist camp or resort hotel, often with a very strong educational or revival type program where people would come to hear famous fundamentalist preachers, bringing large crowds, meeting fellow fundamentalists across the country, and of course Bible camps being much like what you think of when you think of Bible camp. Other fundamentalists created their own media empires as a way to provide information to their audiences, religious information, through radio, through television, writing of books, journals, magazines. All of this to share the message, encourage people, try to protect them from outside influences. But this desire to separate from the world wasn't universally accepted. Throughout the 1940s especially, some fundamentalists began to question this idea of separatism. Should we be as separate from the world as we are? There were some people that were very militant about the separatism, sometimes referred to as the come-outers. Right? Come out from them and be ye separate, from 2 Corinthians chapter 6. They argued that for the purity of the church, Christians, which in their mind, fundamentalists, needed to remove themselves from the liberals in their midst. To associate with liberals or to be connected with American culture would lead to the deterioration of doctrinal purity. They also believed that not only did they need to separate from liberals, they needed to separate from anyone who would be willing to associate with liberals. Right? So you could be a fundamentalist, and if you thought, okay, it's okay for me to associate with this liberal, the come-outers would say, well, I can't associate with you because you're associating with liberals. Right? And so they really wanted to maintain this idea of purity. But others were not as convinced about the separatism. Eventually, trying to drop the label and the stigma of fundamentalism, they took the name neo-evangelicalism and tried to tap into that positive look that they had of the evangelicalism of the 19th century. Essentially, theologically, they're still fundamentalists. The difference is their interaction with culture. And it's ultimately this neo-evangelicalism that would result in the stimulus for both the evangelical left and the Christian right. All of this is happening in the 1940s, 1950s. Billy Graham is associated with this development of this neo-evangelicalism, and a lot of, the neo-evangelicals were often looked down upon by the come-outers. And so one of the things Graham would do was he would partner with churches in an area where he was going for a revival. When he went to a revival or when he was starting a revival in 1950s in New York, he was willing to work with Catholics. Well, the Commouters thought that was just terrible, that he would work with Catholics, and so they kind of wrote Graham off, even though he was very fundamentalist in theology. In the 1960s, this kind of development of fundamentalism kind of took a different turn. A sizable segment of young adults in the 1960s were disaffected with mainstream society.
Is this still under fundamentalists?
Let's go separate. You might separate them out.
Come out.
Essentially, lies over Vietnam, the rejection of the conservative style of their parents, the connection between Christianity and American imperialism in Vietnam and Korea led them to be very upset with American culture. Hippies, as they were called, often rejected the customs of society. Some went on to start communes where they would live with other hippies, but they also adopted a variety of alternative lifestyles, including the use of drugs for altering consciousness. Some older Christians sought to minister to these hippies, and some hippies were concerned by the lack of spirituality in the movement, or the rejection of Christianity that often came with the movement. And so there was an attempt to try and take some elements of the hippie lifestyle, the communal living, the rejection of formalism and church life and worship, and strip down Christianity. Less theological language, putting ideas and concepts in the vernacular, instead of saying something distinctly theological about the nature of Jesus' ontological being in his divine humanness, being the way in which Jesus would connect with human beings, this group would say, hey, Jesus is all right with me. And so you just strip down theology, you adopt the hippie lifestyle. These are the Jesus people. In 1967, in the so-called Summer of Love, Chuck Smith founds Calvary Chapel. In 6 months, the church grew from 200 to 2,000. Hundreds of teens were baptized in the ocean. Beach baptisms occurred about once a month. There were hundreds, sometimes thousands. What was bringing these people to Smith? Well, a lot of people were drug burnouts, and they just burned themselves on their drugs. Runaways, pregnant teens. They were rule-following teens looking for something different. Often they were referred to as street Christians or Jesus people because they would evangelize on the streets or on the beaches out in public. Essentially, there were 3 types of people within the Jesus movement. There were the so-called Jesus freaks, who were the hippies. They were hippie-like, long hair, bare feet, blissful smiles. These were the ones that tended toward living in communes. Others came from groups like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Young Life, Youth for Christ. They didn't like the denominations, they didn't like that aspect, but here in the Jesus movement was this kind of non-denominational type of approach. Others were people that were charismatic. There were large numbers of conversions, some including celebrities, people like Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash. The Jesus people, of course, started in Southern California, but eventually spread throughout the country. Very important in the spread in California was a man named Lonnie Frisbee. He had been discovered by Chuck Smith. He was a hippie, but he was very charismatic as a leader. And after his conversion, claimed to be able to heal, to prophesy, to speak in tongues, but was very successful as a preacher. In fact, he would say, God is blowing everybody's mind because he's saving the hippies. Frisbee and Chuck Smith decided that with this new group developing, this new approach to Christianity, new music was needed. And so they started a variety of folk rock groups. including a new record label called Maranatha Music, coming from the Aramaic, O Lord, come. Very popular on the label was a group called Love Song. Calvary, it started at Calvary out of a group that had started out as a nightclub act that had tried a variety of different religions as well as drugs and was ultimately converted by Smith. Love Song would eventually release an album that was popular in the United States but also does well throughout the world. It actually becomes #1 in the Philippines. Other bands would also start at Calvary Chapel. They would host free concerts. One aspect of the Jesus People culture was Jesus rock, using rock and roll style with religious lyrics. One of the most important early Jesus rock figures was Larry Norman, who made the claim, "Why should the devil have all the good music?" He had grown up as a Baptist that hated hymns and played in rock and roll bands and was even offered a contract with Capitol Records at the age of 18. He would tour as an opening act for groups like Grateful Dead, The Doors, and even Jimi Hendrix, while part of the group People, with an exclamation point. All right, not just people. People! When the group broke up, he would start preaching on the street and performing as a solo act. Not only did this evolve into a new style of popular culture, it would also have a significant impact on church music. One influence of Jesus rock, the Jesus music, was the invention of the praise chorus or the worship song. Often featuring simplified lyrics, many of which would be repeated over and over, often expressing an emotional conception of God or relational imagery, talking about God as Father, or the love a person has for Christ. As with other expressions of the Jesus movement, eventually Jesus rock was mainstream within Protestant Christianity, and the worship music became a very important part of evangelical Christianity, mainstreamed into contemporary Christian music, or CCM. As pop culture music has modified, so has CCM, so that it reflects the current styles of the current trends. Like the worship song, CCM often tends to focus on emotional conceptions and relational language, but often would mask some of the more explicit aspects of language. Instead of saying, "I love Jesus," "I love him." The concern of masking lyrics where the person who knows, while other people might not necessarily know, made CCM more marketable. Beginning in the 1980s, contemporary Christian artists began to cross over into mainstream pop through innocuous songs or through songs that weren't explicitly religious. People like Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith in the 1990s, Sixpence None the Richer. By the 20th century, the late 20th century, many of the recording companies that had originally focused on Christian music had been bought by mainstream companies, like Warner Music, for example. So that a lot of those that had originally been Christian in their orientation were absorbed into secular. And the same kind of thing is true with Christian publishing houses as well. And Christian publishers like Zondervan, Thomas Nelson, and they're owned by groups like Harper and Row, and so these parent companies holding on to the label so people don't recognize, oh, it's this secular group that actually runs this Christian publishing house. Other changes in the 20th century, again, we could talk about more about others, but I want to finish up by talking about some things related to children. Children, of course, have been important in the history of Christianity throughout, but there were changes in the 20th century in the practice of children and how children influenced practice. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Catholic ideas about children began to reflect Protestant ideas, specifically viewing children as spiritual innocents or as spiritual gods. We can refer to this as kind of the Catholic age of children. Many of the so-called Marian apparitions were to children. Right? And the idea being that the reason Mary appeared so often to children is that they are innocent. Pope Pius X in the 19-teens began to argue for children to be more involved in the spiritual life, the sacramental life of Catholicism. He would push for an earlier age for First Communion. Previously, most Catholic children took First Communion around the age of 11 or 12. Pius, however, said age 7 is already too late, but then didn't set a specific age. Children are reflections of the mirror image of God, thought Pius. In fact, you get a glimpse of God in children, and that they are channels for God and for goodness. Pius would also encourage religious instruction at an early age, beginning around 4 or 5. Sunday schools to this point have largely been a Protestant phenomenon. While a lot of this positive notions about children were important for Catholicism, on the other hand, children acted like children. So there was a lot of attention as well in Protestantism and Catholicism on regulating children's behavior. And so you have a variety of instructional manuals on discipline, physical discipline, those kind of things. In Protestantism, very important would be somebody like James Dobson, who founded the focus on the family, including he wrote books like Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child. Wrote a bunch of other books as well. But this focus on controlling children's behavior. Another development in the latter part of the 20th century was the creation of children's worship. Now, as far as I can tell, it's a little bit unclear as to when this actually started, but by the end of 20th century, it was common in most Protestant denominations and non-denominational groups to separate the children off during the worship time. The practice served a variety of purposes. It could be used to introduce or instruct children in the faith, specifically on their level. It could also be used to teach children how to behave in the worship service, and it also got disruptive children out of adult worship space. Not only were there specific practices developed with respect to children or modified for children, there were new material cultural products for children in the latter 20th century, specifically thinking of toys and media. Just as one example of this would be the creation of VeggieTales, which started in the 1990s. Computerized, if you don't know what VeggieTales are, computer-animated, anthropomorphized vegetables. Bob the tomato, Larry the cucumber, Junior asparagus.
Well, when you put it like that, it sounds dumb.
Yeah. They were originally started out as 30-minute shows about a biblical character or a character trait. And of course were very humorous, including pop culture references, but not boring or irreverent. Videos such as Josh and the Big Wall, Madame Blueberry, Where's God When I'm Scared, and King George and the Duckling. But one of the things that is important to recognize with VeggieTales is that although it's kind of starting out from this evangelical foundation, right? The people that are starting it are evangelicals. There were no explicit references to Jesus, and often focused on Old Testament stories and characters. And so this kind of mainstreaming, attempted to make more marketable. Of course, that connection to the emotional and the relational language was also present in VeggieTales, with every episode concluding with God made you special and He loves you very much. The videos would become very successful, present in a variety of general market stores, Walmart, Kmart, when it was around, and Target, as well as, of course, Christian markets. One of the interesting things with VeggieTales, which has also been bought by another company, Big Idea had some very poor financial management, and there was a lot of mismanagement, especially as they got to the point of making Jonah, their first feature film. And so they ended up having to sell the company off in order to kind of avoid bankruptcy. And so it too is kind of now owned. But they have a new series on Netflix. I've not watched any of that to see how much of it is still maintained. Although the founder of Big Idea still voices Larry the Cucumber. That was one of the things that's still maintained, even though he lost control of the company when it was sold. There were a variety of products, other products and brand lines, some much more explicitly evangelical than VeggieTales, like Bible Man. Has anybody seen Bible Man? Yeah. That's much more, in your face with the Christianity than VeggieTales is. VeggieTales, of course, is Christian, but doesn't talk about Jesus and other things. That brings us to the end of the 20th century. And so in our last class, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, our focus is going to be on talking a little bit about the 21st century. We're not too far into the 21st century to say much, but to talk about some trends. What's going on in Christianity? What's going on with where is it growing? Where is it decreasing? And some of those aspects. So that'll be our focus when we pick up